Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
A reunion or a place to cheat on your husband? Today's story has a similar plot. Enjoy it! This is my story, the story of my life and how I ended up here, in this place that I never thought about. But I am here. All writers write about what they know, and this is who I am and what I do. There is no great American novel in my future. I'm not that inspired, and I'm not that narcissistic. I've done my share of freelance work for some mid-sized and more established publications. I've published a few essays, a few exposés, and a few satirical articles. You may have read them, but most likely you haven't. This job is interesting, exhausting, and rewarding, but it doesn't pay my bills. Quite often, these articles are simply a labor of love. The hours of research alone erase any notion of making money as a writer. It's almost like you work 40 hours a week and get paid for 5. This may be enough to survive, but not enough to truly live. Writing guides is how I make a living. I don't write instructions, I write manuals. So you may be angry as you build your IKEA furniture, but you won't be angry at me. No, I'm contracted to write employee manuals, software manuals, and other materials to promote what people want other people to do. Sounds simple, but that's not true. People tell me how something should work, and I put it on paper so they don't have to. Then they pay me, and quite well. I can promise you that if you can do this, write something that explains the process clearly and completely, you will be able to find a job. There's a lot of it out there. It's not glamorous. There are no long hours spent in a coffee shop where you, like a beatnik, ponder the meaning of life. There are no awards banquets, book signings, or promotional tours. I got a contract, I spend time with people, I find out what they know and what they want to say, and I write it down. Then I leave. I spend most of my time alone, with only my laptop for company. I am a writer, the most boring in the world. This was not my dream job. Hell, I didn't even know this was a job. This is definitely not what I thought when I studied economics and statistics in college. To be honest, I didn't know what I wanted to do after getting a degree in one of these fields, but it wasn't this. I started making a living as a writer quite by accident. Exactly a week after starting my first real job, I made my third mistake when I tried to sign up for company benefits. I tried to follow the benefits manual that was given to me during employee orientation. I didn't think anything of my first 2 mistakes, I just redid the documents. But the third mistake drove me crazy. I was confident that I had done everything right because I had been extra careful after being embarrassed by the first 2 mistakes. My indignation led to a conversation with the HR manager, which ended with a challenge: if you think you can write it better, be my guest. That's what I did. Over the next weekend, I rewrote the sections of the manual that led me to the mistakes. This resulted in a rewrite of all orientation materials, which led to revisions to other departments' manuals. This led to a recommendation from our COO to one of his golf buddies, which led to my first contract, which led to my career. And 15 years later, I still haven't used any marketing other than word of mouth. All the difficult decisions in my life have come at the most inopportune times. Why do the really hard decisions and the really hard work always come at a time when you are least able to fully focus on them? When I crested the hill, the view was exactly as I remembered it. To the south rose a mountain range lushly covered with green pine trees and strewn with autumn flowers, such as only aspens have. The river snaked through the valley below me, and the highway followed its every bend. To the north, jagged rock formations dotted the otherwise sloping plains. And then there was the sunset. I've been to almost every state in the U.S. and have never seen a sunset that could compare to the sunset in the Rocky Mountains. Maybe it's because the air is cleaner or the altitude is higher. Honestly, I do not know. But on every clear day, the sky turns pink, red, and orange in a style not found anywhere else. I also knew, based on experience, that I still had almost 2 hours to spare. I could see the top of a mountain range that was not far from my destination. Perhaps it was a metaphor for my life. My destination seemed so close, it seemed like an easy trip, it seemed like it should take no more than 15 minutes. But I knew it would take much longer. The road seemed so peaceful and calm, but in fact, the path to the top was long and winding, and every turn of the road exposed you to greater danger. The higher you went, the longer it took to fall down, and you didn't realize it until you looked back to where you started. Now I understand this feeling much better. It was here, in this place, that I first realized that many things people consider grandiose are, in fact, meaningless. In an hour, there will be darkness, pitch darkness, a reminder that every person is alone and needs something to light their way. I've often tried to explain the difference between a night in the city and a night outside my hometown. It's hard to convey to people, and they don't really believe it. On Earth, where one city ends in the same place where another begins, the stars are simply erased. Here, the stars seem limitless. I paused for a few minutes to catch a reminder of how insignificant we and our problems are. My trip came at the best time of my life and the worst time of my life. There was no doubt that I needed a break. Life had become stressful and painful, and here, everything would be simpler, or at least less complicated. Or maybe it would just be a good place to hide and pretend my problems don't exist. This place, where everyone waved as they passed by and stopped to lend a helping hand when someone needed it, was good for that. It was a good place to hide. It was no surprise that my mother died. She refused cancer treatment. She wanted to be in her own home. She didn't need visitors. She wanted to be alone. Towards the end, we talked on the phone for a long time, until she became too weak and tired to carry on long conversations. Then we had short conversations until she lost the ability to speak. Then there were text messages until she was too weak to type. And then she died. As always, my mother was there to help me. It's amazing what you learn in the most unexpected places. I grew up in a town of 900 people. It was a place where I never fit in with society. However, it was the place where I was able to learn the most about life. For example, people make mistakes. Those who repent and correct mistakes are forgiven, and everyone moves on. Those who do not repent and do so are soon cast out in order to preserve the health and vitality of the rest of society. My mother often talked about forgiveness and the important things in life. Towards the end of her life, I also learned that each person is responsible for their own happiness. You are only as happy as you allow yourself to be, and you are only as unhappy as you allow other people to make you. Here in my hometown, people didn't have anything special. Most people were content with a home and friends and eked out a meager existence with a smile. But there were a small number of people who were never happy. They blamed everyone around for their problems. Such people were treated with tolerance, but usually, they were talked about after a deep sigh of "here we go again." I never intended to return to my hometown after graduating from high school. I knew it, my mom knew it, and honestly, so did everyone else. I wasn't shunned, but I never fit in with society. I was a child who constantly ordered books from big city libraries. I was the kid who took English, math, science, and history extramural because my high school didn't offer them. I was a fatherless child, one of two in my hometown. Don't get me wrong, the people there weren't stupid, in any case, in fact. If you needed to know anything about coal, methane, life on Earth, or how to be a good neighbor, there were experts everywhere. But the same group of people were not interested in pop culture or politics. They had never seen politicians or tour buses and therefore had no interest in the outside world or voting, for that matter. Most likely, it was hatred based on years of experience of politicians sending their sons and fathers to die in distant places and then bringing them back draped in a flag. And musicians selling albums at concerts dedicated to the same thing. Their independence from the outside world and indifference to it were deserved. They weren't interested in technology. In all my formative years, there was only one computer gathering dust in the public library. There was no cable television, and only one massive satellite dish on the Taylor Ranch. After all, the Taylors were the richest family in the area. No, here, the only important things in life were discussed in a diner on Sunday morning after church. The evening news was never more important than who in town needed help. Here, people cared about each other, kept to themselves, and said to hell with everyone and everything. Taking out a loan was as easy as going to the grocery store with a note from mom saying she would pay the bill when she came into town in a few days. As a child, you couldn't get away with anything. People knew you, they knew your parents, and someone was always making sure nothing got out of hand. It was strangely soothing to hear the roar of the cattle drives as the wheels of my late model foreign sports sedan passed over them. Then I felt a sense of peace creeping into my soul when at the only intersection with a stop sign, I paused for a few seconds. My car didn't fit into the parade of American trucks and SUVs like never before, but this was my hometown. Life is full of coincidences, and the world is small. There's really no other way to explain it. My job required me to travel frequently. When I was younger, I hardly needed an apartment. I was never home anyway. As I got older and wiser, my services became more in demand and my prices increased significantly. But the best part was that I could set my own schedule. For the past 15 years, as my priorities have shifted to more important things, I have traveled for no more than 8 consecutive days once a month. And the rest of the time, I have worked in the safety and comfort of my home. These were the things I treasured most: my friends, my children, and until recently, my wife. However, I was an expert at life on the road. I've learned all the tricks to make the most of my time spent in airports, hotels, and restaurants. I have become an expert at packing. I could name the healthiest food choices in almost every restaurant in every city I visited. I could also name the friendliest places to drink beer in almost every major city in the US. That Thursday, I was in one of these places. That Thursday, my life changed forever. Life is full of coincidences. What if I didn't have such a knack for talking to strangers? What if I didn't have such a morbid fascination with eclectic people and their different habits? What if I stayed in my room and went to bed at a reasonable hour in preparation for an early morning flight home the next day? Would I be better off? Would my life be better if I hadn't met him? I attended a small liberal arts college in the upper Midwest with an outstanding academic reputation, a great music and choir program, and some pretty terrible sports teams. It was perfect for me. I know that at some of the larger universities in the area, the annual student population was in the tens of thousands. There were 3,200 people studying in our college. This may not seem like much, but it was a far cry from my high school graduating class of 14 people. College, what can I tell you? Everything was different. I arrived on campus as a child facing the world for the first time away from home like never before. To be honest, I was scared to death. From what I know about college experiences, mine was pretty average. I was on a full scholarship, and knowing that if I lost the funding, my college career would be over, that was enough to keep me in check. I signed up for the choir and was one of only 4 students in the history of the school to earn a spot in the top auditioning choir for all 4 years. I guess the years of being the only under 50 member of the church choir on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings have finally paid off. My school was unique in that the choir members were more popular on campus than the athletes. When your football team loses every week and your basketball team misses the conference tournament every year, it's pretty hard for an athlete to claim the title of big man on campus. But the choir was known throughout the country, received awards. And we performed to full houses during our annual tour. This may seem like an alternate universe where geeks take over the world, but for me, it was perfect. I thrived during my college years, and more importantly, I grew. Good grades gave me confidence, and my status in the choir provided me with a large group of friends for life. I wouldn't trade my 4 years as a student for anything in the world. College was where I had my first non-dance date. It was there that I experienced my first real kiss, make-out session, and below-the-belt pleasure. Don't get me wrong, this experience was gained during most of my first 3 years of study. I was not Don Juan, but I grew from a scared child into a decent-looking, confident young man. And it's not because of my increased height, which reached 6 feet 2 inches, it's not about wider shoulders or an improved bench press. It's not that it's become easier for me to talk to anyone about anything. This is not about the praise of my professors or my election as choir president. It wasn't actually any of those things, but it was when they were all combined into one complete package. College was also where I fell in love. Stacy Henderson was a sophomore and a new choir member. In her senior year as choir chairman, it was my job to welcome all new members. Our first meeting was supposed to be nothing less. It was supposed to be a quick afternoon meet and greet, perhaps over a cup of coffee, which I've done dozens of times. It turned out to be much more. Only once in my life have I felt so comfortable with someone so quickly. It was that day. After a few introductory questions, Stacy and I spent the next 4 hours exchanging life stories and getting to know each other. We had so much in common that it was almost creepy. But I liked Stacy from the very beginning. We didn't start dating right away. In fact, we never started dating at all. I liked Stacy so much that I always made sure she was invited to any event. I had a big group of friends, guys and girls, and we were always up to something. I just made sure it was on. After some time, she became a full member of the group. Stacy was the daughter of an Air Force pilot and part of a military family. Her father died during a training exercise the summer after graduating from school. I didn't remember anything about my father because he died in a motorcycle accident when I was 2 years old. She was an only child like me. She never felt like she fit in with the kids from the families on the many military bases she lived on. She has always been a little more academically advanced than her peers. I could understand her. She was a long way from home, although she was just one plane away from her home in Anchorage, Alaska, which coincidentally was only an hour's drive from my paternal grandparents' home near Palmer, Wasilla. They both died before I met them, but I heard stories from my mother about the family's stone quarry located far to the north. During our first semester studying together, Stacy became one of my closest friends, perhaps the closest. That's how we started. When did our relationship change? I realized what Stacy meant to me during the first week of classes of our second semester after returning from Christmas holidays. She and I spent every free moment together, talking about our holidays and catching up. On Friday after our return, it started snowing, and it continued. By mid-afternoon, there were already 5 inches on the ground, and it was still snowing. Classes were canceled. I hadn't heard from Stacy, and I started to worry about her. I can't say why. I put on my winter gear and started walking toward her dorm room from my off-campus apartment. The roads were too treacherous to travel by car, and perhaps the decision to walk 2 miles across campus to her room was not the best decision. But I couldn't reach her on the phone and couldn't help but make sure she was okay. The roads were terrible, but the paths through campus where there was little cover due to the massive trees that guarded them weren't too bad. 25 minutes later, I stood in front of her dorm and clearly saw that the power was out in her part of campus. When I entered the building, I set a goal for myself: find my Stacy and make sure she's safe. It wasn't difficult to find her. All residents of the hostel gathered in a general crowd in the recreation area on the first floor. I scanned the blanket-covered masses until I found her. She looked up at me almost at the same time. In those few seconds, her smile and the relief I felt were such powerful symbols of what Stacy meant to me. I think she felt the same way. "Stacy, let's get your things before it gets dark outside. You can stay with me until the power comes on," I said. She put on a tiny smile and answered, almost in a whisper, "Okay, Jacob." This is how our love was born. Of course, there were obstacles. For example, if the campus utility vehicle hadn't been paving the sidewalks the moment we started our walk back to my apartment, we probably would have gotten stuck and frozen to death during the walk. This weekend with Stacy was probably the most non-intimate fun I've ever had alone with a woman. We spent Friday night watching movies snuggled under the covers, eating frozen pizza, and drinking hot chocolate. I slept on the couch, and Stacy slept in my bed. We made pancakes on Saturday morning, played board games in the afternoon, and had a video game tournament in the evening. I lost and was forced to slave at the stove preparing our dinner of hot dogs, potato chips, and baked beans. For my efforts, I was rewarded with a hug while watching TV that evening and a kiss on the cheek before bed. Sunday morning brought clear skies, clean streets, and a walk to church after the service and brunch at a diner near campus. We held hands on the way back to her dorm. The hugs and kisses that ended our weekend left a smile on my face for days. After that, we were inseparable. Our social activities didn't change much. We were just a couple, Jacob and Stacy. We never discussed that after graduation I would get a job in Minneapolis. There were no tears, no worries. My apartment would be an hour's drive from her dorm room, but we both kind of assumed it would work out. Stacy still had 2 years of college to complete. I had to start a career. As I already said, my apartment served only as a place for mail delivery. Honestly, a storage room and a mailbox would have suited me just fine. After the first 6 months, when I stopped working 9 to 5, if I wasn't traveling, I was visiting Stacy. Apart from this, I have nothing to say about our early years. I suppose we were no different from any other young couple in love. Everything was new and exciting. There was never a dull moment, never a time to pause and reflect. Everything was amazing. Although we talked a lot about what each of us hoped to experience in life, we never talked about ourselves. I knew what Stacy was thinking, and she could read me like a book. We were going to be together, and we both knew it. My proposal, although expected, ultimately still came as a surprise. I made it during the annual choir banquet at Stacy's senior class graduation in front of all our friends. All marriages have their difficulties and difficult times. We had very, very few of them. My business took off while Stacy was still finishing school. After she graduated from high school and was still trying to decide what career path she wanted to take, we rented a tiny apartment just in case and to save as much money as possible. Living with someone, even your best friend, is always risky. As much as I love Stacy, there were days when she just annoyed the crap out of me. We may have had more in common than any other couple I've ever met. But our personalities were not alike. I think that our upbringing had a direct bearing on this. Stacy grew up in a tough military environment. I grew up in the mountains of Wyoming. Her daily activities were scheduled and required dedication. I took on everything that the day put in front of me. In the beginning, while we were setting boundaries and testing each other out, this difference caused a lot of friction. Not too long later, I learned to appreciate our differences as Stacy's gift to our marriage, and I loved her even more for being strong in areas where I needed improvement. I'm sure she felt the same way. It was a night that always brought us back to equal conditions. When we were young, our love life has always been good, often great, and often damn fantastic, with a few twists and turns. I was a virgin when Stacy and I first made love a few months into our marriage. I'm sure Stacy was a virgin too, although by unspoken agreement, we never mentioned our previous bed experiences. During our first night together, it seemed like Stacy was just as nervous as I was and just as excited about the moment as I was. Exploring Stacy's whole body for the first time was an unforgettable experience for me. She was stunningly beautiful without clothes. Her body responded to my touch, her face flushed, her breathing quickened. We were perfect for each other. After our first time and for a very long time in our relationship, we had intim every time we were alone, as if I were a man on death row with one conjugal date left. For her part, Stacy took great pride in her role as a seductress, finding more and more ways to entice me. During the first year of our marriage, we spent most of the time, when I wasn't on the road, in bed, or on the couch, or in the shower, or on the kitchen table, or in a darkened parking lot. Every marriage has its problems, but night was not one of ours. The only truly difficult time came at the beginning of the second year of our married life. I started traveling more often, Stacy started a new job, our schedules conflicted, and our communication suffered. For months, we nagged each other to death and complained about things more than we enjoyed each other's company. At the height of the relationship, I was miserable and tired of all the arguing. When Stacy called me for planning to attend the annual choir reunion without her when she had to attend a conference for work, I began to look forward to a few days away from my wife and realized that this was not a good thing. The homecoming went well, but it was still a little cold at home when I got back. Then, out of the blue, after all these weeks and all this arguing, Stacy apologized. At the time, I considered this the most sincere apology I had ever received. She said that her job was stressful, that she didn't have enough time to spend with me, and that she was frustrated with our erratic intimate schedule. I apologized for letting the situation get out of hand and not making more of an effort to make her feel valued, and we moved on. 2 weeks later, she announced that she was pregnant with our first child, a little girl. After 2 years of our life together, our first son was born. 2 years after this, our family was expanded with twin boys. Stacy stayed home with our kids until they were all off to school. Then, she went to work, but very rarely, to keep herself busy and active. Children were like the glue that held our puzzle pieces together. We were almost inseparable. After the birth of our first child, we took care of each other and the children. We rarely argued about anything and never about anything important. I loved my family and their daily reminders of what is truly important in life. Stacy was a fantastic mother, the best. As a life partner, she was even better. We missed all the things that cause young parents to have a reduced night life. The more children we had, the more excited we became. While 3 to 4 times a week was the norm, weeks of daily intim were not unusual. Even my vasectomy after the birth of twins was like a jolt of energy in our intimate life. We had reckless intim for several weeks after my recovery. It's like all the stars are aligned to ensure that we always have enough alone time. As adults, there was simply nothing wrong with our marriage, our night life, or our family, until this happened. I truly believe that it was our constant flirting that led to all this intim. The more Stacy did for the family, the happier I was. I kept sharing these thoughts with Stacy when I was around her. I had no filter on my thoughts. If her food was delicious, I told her so. If I thought she looked hot in her new outfit, I said so. My mind was constantly filled with thoughts of Stacy and her family. If I came up with a smart idea, I would write it down and give her the note later. If I saw her favorite chocolate bar or flower or anything under $20, I would buy it for her and surprise her. Someday she was the same with me. It was great being in love with your best friend and constantly hearing how much he loved you and how much you turned your partner on. Those few months of disappointment at the beginning of our marriage were just a blip in our lives, which were soon forgotten and replaced by a love that I cannot describe. If you are a father, you know what I'm talking about. You loved your spouse before you had children, but you treasured her after. You admire her inner strength as a mother and love her children unconditionally. This is the most amazing experience on earth. For 15 wonderful years, this was my world until it stopped being one. I'm not an expert on cheating wives. You can take it to the bank, approve it, and cash out any amount of money. I would put my faith in my wife's fidelity against any bet you would offer, and to find out that I was wrong and for so long was the most difficult, spirit-crushing, disorienting event in my life. If this has happened to you, I cannot compare my feelings with yours. I can only assume that everyone's experience is different. If this hasn't happened to you, consider yourself blessed. All I can offer are the thoughts that ran through my head and how over the course of 7 days, my entire outlook on life changed. At first, there was shock. From the moment my mind connected the reality of what I heard and saw with my life until I woke up hours later on the floor of a hotel bathroom, my body was on autopilot. I remember exchanging business cards with Robert Paulson. I remember shaking his hand and not wanting to do it. I remember how cold I was, how he didn't notice my trembling hands. I'll never know. I remember taking the elevator up to my floor in the hotel. My stomach rose into my throat the moment it started moving. I remember bending over and putting my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath and compose myself. I remember the feeling in my chest. This was no ordinary pain, not even the most excruciating one. It was something much more. It was as if my entire body was being squeezed by some invisible force, causing the bones of my body to grind against every muscle, tendon, and nerve ending. It literally hurt every time I moved, even just breathing. Months later, I remembered this moment and gave it an exact name. It was the pain of death. At that moment, my love for my wife died, despair was next, and it lasted much longer. My usual rise at 4 a.m. hardly attracted my attention. When it did ring, it was a habit, not a conscious thought. At the airport, my first conscious thought was that my socks didn't match, one was brown, the other black. Airport security still let me through. This was the first of many things I didn't notice in those first few days. My clothes were clean but wrinkled. I showered but decided to skip some other basic self-care routines. With my finger-combed hair and unshaven face, I bought overpriced chewing gum from the gift shop to hide the fact that I hadn't brushed my teeth or used mouthwash. I looked out the window as the plane took off, and then for the first time in my life, I fell asleep in the air. I woke up when the wheels touched the ground and brought me out of my slumber. After that, my usual excitement of being home and minutes away from meeting my wife and children gave way to a sullen apathy. Was the sky overcast, or did everything look gray for some other reason? I can't say for sure, but the colors in the world have definitely disappeared. Indifference to things was an unusual experience for me. Even at your worst, you still have survival instincts, and my instincts ruled the day. I was angry that my luggage was delayed while disembarking the plane, but I refused to swear at the baggage attendant because there was a mother standing nearby with her children. I didn't care that I almost caused an accident by driving into oncoming traffic, but I wasn't driving recklessly, and I was wearing my seatbelt. Even at his worst, my wild beast was a weakling and probably a coward. I hated myself so much for this realization. Coming home that first day was surreal. It was like I was watching a movie about myself going through the process of reuniting with my family. I received hugs from the twins, knuckles from my oldest son, and a kiss on the cheek from my wife. It was a miracle I didn't throw up in the foyer when her skin first touched mine. I clung to my daughter's arms as if she were the only medicine that could cure my illness. Stacy immediately became concerned about my behavior. "Are you okay, Jacob? You're acting strange and look like you're about to fall." "I do not feel well," that was the only thing I could say. After that, I retreated to the bedroom and chased sleep until I caught it and forced it into submission. I would periodically wake up to the sound of Stacy checking on me. I preferred to drive her away with a groan and lean back on the pillow. I repeated this action for the next 2 days, fighting off Stacy's attempts to get me to call a doctor. The fact that at times she barely left my side and seemed genuinely concerned about me did not console me at all. And then my mother died. Sitting at a bar and sipping beer was nothing new. It was nothing new to have a fool sitting next to me, talking about his success in business, his charmed life, and how good he was as a lover. Robert Paulson was no different from hundreds of other boastful idiots I've met at the bar. He was a little older than he wanted to admit, a little out of shape than he wanted to believe, and not nearly as charming as he thought he was. What I always admired about guys like him, and in places like this, is that their behavior was always supported by circumstances. I sat on a bar stool to have a beer. Robert Paulson was here to find someone to have a night with. Guys like me changed into business attire, just not caring what they looked like as long as they were comfortable. Robert Paulson loosened his tie but wanted to be considered successful. The suit, the watch, the keychain with the strategically placed automaker logo, all this was designed to entice. "Hey, look at me, I'm fine." His speech was predictable. He acknowledged just enough of the conversations going on around him that it allowed him to flip the script and shift the focus to himself and how wonderful he was. The funny thing is, if Robert Paulson had been alone, and most of the time he wasn't, he would probably have succeeded in his quest because the women who showed up here were single. It didn't matter how beautiful or smart or affectionate they were, if they were here alone, they were looking for Robert Paulson. For me, these places were a great place to experiment without any risk. In my job, the faster I could get people to actually talk to me, to tell me their real story, the better. The bar was a great place to practice, and Robert Paulson was my next lab rat. So we chatted. I let him spew a few lies about the success he had achieved and gave him a few compliments. I threw his ego a bone by telling him that the hot blonde at the end of the bar had been looking at him for the last hour when in fact I thought she was looking at me. Then, just as I had hoped, it happened. Robert Paulson opened up to me. He was twice divorced, lonely, and tired of working on the road. He couldn't understand how his life had ended up like this, a revolving door of meaningless intimacy and loneliness. He was no different from the others, and I was able to find out his real story. After finishing my beer, I usually ended our conversation and returned to my room. Normally, I would have refused his offer to drink more, but I didn't. There was something so familiar about him, although I was sure that our paths had never crossed before. For some reason, I just couldn't leave. So, I politely answered his questions about my job, my family, and where I was from. I could pinpoint the exact moment when he became wary again. I knew that when the false bravado returned, I would hear another "I slept with that hottie once." I didn't know that his confession would have any effect on me, but it had an impact. I listened to Robert Paulson brag about how he once slept with a married woman in St. Paul a few years ago. I watched as he searched his brain for her name among the lists of his other conquests. Was it Lacey or Tracy? He couldn't remember exactly, but she had clearly left an impression. He described her body as if he were looking at a photograph of her. He recalled his 2 lust-filled days in the conference hotel with the biggest he had ever met with great thoughtfulness. Yes, man, this woman was the biggest I have ever dated. Lacey from St. Paul via Alaska, best night of my life. Did my life really end when he raised his glass and drank the rest in a mock greeting, or did it just seem to me? The death of my mother unsettled me for a while. My unhealthy thoughts were replaced by the need to make decisions regarding my mother and her possessions. It took me about 5 minutes to decide that I was going to my hometown. It only took me 4 to decide that I would go alone. Any person without remorse would attribute my emotions and unstable behavior to illness and grief from the loss of my mother. But my wife watched my actions as if she were watching an animal in a cage on the verge of escape. My miraculous recovery from the illness did nothing to console her. For most of the next 36 hours, I basically ignored her to attend to more pressing issues. But that didn't mean she didn't have the opportunity to drive a stake through my heart one more time. I walked back to the bedroom from the living room and collected the documents needed to complete my mother's case. She sat on her side of the bed and whispered into the phone, "He knows." I do not know how. What should I do? I went down to the kitchen to drink a glass of water, then I went back to the bedroom, making as much noise as possible. Stacy was in the bathroom when I arrived. If the number on the phone when I pressed redial had been Robert Paulson, I think I might have killed her. I have already dreamed several times about how I do exactly this. Would it be better? Honestly, I don't believe the answer to this question is yes, but I won't lie to you and say I haven't thought about it. Sometimes, when you think about the person you love more than anyone in the world, and you hope beyond all hope that you can kill her, make her suffer, and not get caught, what does that mean? Thinking about Stacy made me angry. Being angry at Stacy made me incredibly sad. Sadness made me sad, and frustration made me think about my dilemma and back to Stacy. It was a revolving door of pain. In fact, it is doubtful that I would ever be able to take another person's life. I'm just not wired that way. I've never been in a fight in my life that was more than minor pushing and shoving. And I know that some of you who were not in my shoes at the time listening to this think that only a crazy person would even think about such a thing. I honestly don't care what you think about my train of thought. My wife is alive. Judge me on this. Shockingly, learning that the phone number belonged to her best friend Trisha made me feel even worse. My devastating problem, the worst thing that ever happened to me, wasn't even a secret. It was the perfect trio of knowledge: Stacy, Trisha, and Robert Paulson. I pretended to be asleep one last time and waited for the familiar sound of my wife's breathing to make sure she was asleep. I paused, remembering that I used to find comfort in recognizing that sound, no matter the stresses of my day. I could always count on my wife's nap to remind me that the troubles were behind me and that a new, uneventful day would arrive in a few short hours. That night, it didn't matter. I grabbed my still-packed travel suitcase and headed to the kids' rooms to take another look at them before the trip. They grew so fast, they were such good kids. I paused for a second at my daughter's door. She was a teenager. My princess had grown into the beautiful young woman I had always dreamed of. She's sure to break hearts, through no fault of hers. Mine will come first. As I walked out the door, I left a note: "I'm going home to sort out my mother's things. It probably won't take more than a week. Jacob." If you hadn't guessed, what came next was anger. My anger grew little by little throughout the 10.27 miles I drove to my hometown. At first, I was angry with myself. How could I be so stupid? How could I not punch this in the face? Why didn't I confront my cheating wife? It couldn't have been easier. I loved her, or at least I did until recently. Confrontation would lead to confirmation that it could be worse than what I felt at that moment. It also meant that I was a coward. Why was I a damn coward? No one and nothing could save me from the rage burning in my mind: our pastor, our friends, my mother, her mother, and the patrolman who gave me a well-deserved speeding ticket. No one was safe from my inner rage. Everyone got their fifth place kicked in my head, everyone except my children. It wasn't their fault. My loving wife, she got it the most. My emotions ranged from pleasant thoughts about my children to depressive thoughts about what I knew would now be my life to painfully vindictive thoughts about how to exact devastating revenge on years of lies. They say there's a fine line between love and hate. It should be added that there's a fine line between blind white rage and complete madness. That's exactly how I felt. It didn't take long before the events of my week took their toll, and I started to get tired. But at the same time, adrenaline was rushing through me. I was literally too excited to sleep. I have never been in a situation where my life depended on my next decision. I have never been so scared that I thought that my inaction would cost me my life. But in those moments, I knew what the fight or flight response felt like. After it had dragged on for days, luckily, the distance seemed to calm my nerves. I stopped 3 times during the trip to get gas, eat, and take a nap in the car. I finished the trip in just over 23 hours, exhausted and depressed. My hometown hasn't changed. The people were basically the same. There were a few newbies, some oldies, and even a few people I'd always hoped to never see again. They were all glad to see me, sorry about my mom's death, and each of them hoped I would stay in touch. Of course, these were platitudes. More than likely, I will never come back here again. I'd only been here a half-dozen times since high school, and now I had no reason to go back. At the end of 4 days, I was sure of 2 things. My mother had lived a calm, fulfilling, and generally happy life, and I had pleasant memories of her. The reality was a little different. Mom was tough, straight to the point, pulling no punches, taking no. This was what I loved and hated most about her. On the bright side, I never had to worry about what my mom thought of me or my choices. She was just letting me know. On the other hand, it might be nice to have a little unconditional reassurance from time to time. Instead, she taught me to be independent and stand up for myself. I think overall I was very lucky despite my childhood desires to have a Miss Suea stay-at-home mom. Boxes were piled up in the living room. Some of them were donated to the church for charity, most ended up in the trash. There were no family heirlooms to carefully pack for the trip home, just photographs, letters, and a few items that had special meaning to me. The pile I kept for myself was the smallest in the group. Unfortunately, while packing was a nice distraction from my problems, it didn't solve anything. To be honest, I wasn't sure they could be solved. My anger and disappointment dissipated just a little. They were buried but not replaced with unanswered questions. And so, during these 4 days, I wrote down these questions. This was what I was good at. 126 questions, questions that will hopefully lead to the answer to the one question that matters to me that I didn't write down. Do I still have a marriage left to return home? I spent evenings rereading them and writing them into emails from time to time. I rearranged them, trying to move from the least important issues in my opinion, such as night and affairs that I knew about, to the most important one, important things. Things that will have a lasting impact on my family. I spent quite a bit of time thinking about what answers I would consider acceptable. Often, I found that I couldn't come up with a viable option and was forced to replace it with a what I can live with answer. When I finished answering my questions, I emailed them to my wife with a short note. I will need your answers to these questions, best in writing. My point was quite simple. Her answer would tell me a lot. If she had gone to a lawyer in preparation for a divorce, he would never have allowed her to put her thoughts in writing, and I would not have received any answers. It would have been everything I needed to know. This happened almost immediately. As soon as I clicked the submit button, this is what followed. There are things in your life that you simply take for granted. I don't mean things that you ignore and hope are still there when you start paying attention to them again. I mean things that are simply always true, things that become the foundation of the life you build. Sometimes, it's the big things, sometimes it's the little things, but they are always true. Your mother loves you. No matter what stupid things you have done, you can count on it. She will bring you comfort in difficult times. There are a lot of them. The sun will always rise in the morning. The tax inspector comes every year. Your children are yours. If you are not a father, then this next part may not be clear to you. The very first moment you hold your baby in your arms, you begin to dream. You dream about what you hope your child's life will be like. You hope that you can achieve this dream. And every day, you have a new goal, a new task, a new life for which you must be responsible. And regardless of any trials and tribulations, you are rewarded every day with the love of a child. You are someone's hero, someone's protector, someone's whole world. Little by little, day by day, their world expands. Then, you begin to realize the mistakes you made yourself and try to protect them from the same pitfalls. Then, Your children make their own mistakes, and you help them recover and comfort them. It's hard work, and there's no break. This is the definition of full-time, and it's worth it. All my children had completely different characters, even the twins were different from each other. But one of the great things about being a father, if you're anything like yourself, is finding what you passed on to your children, your quirks. The little details that make you, well, you. When you see them being passed on, you can't help but smile. I could try to write them all down, but many of them are just personal things that are hard to describe, but they were there. Some are easy to describe. All my children loved music. That was a big part of both Stacy and me. The boys all looked like me, right down to their straight hair, which became more and more curled as they got older. My daughter was Daddy's little princess and my favorite. I know, parents don't have favorites. I loved all my children equally, but my daughter was the sweetest thing in the world, and she always had to sit next to me or sit on my lap or hold my hand. Our connection began right from her birth, when she would often not stop crying until she was in my arms. This continued until the evening before my last work trip, when we went to the movies for another father-daughter date. My daughter was almost a clone of her mother. She had beautiful eyes. When she was a little girl, they were brown. People said they looked like mine. I never thought so. The color was close, but the shape was different. The more she grew older, the more green the color appeared. She had cute little dimples, a beautiful smile, and her mother's hair and those piercing green eyes. Robert Paulson's eyes. Now I knew, and it shook me to the core. Was everything I believed in a lie, or is it just like that? I don't know whether, fortunately or unfortunately, I was in no hurry to go home. The positive side of this equation was that my anger dissipated. I wanted to make good decisions, and my anger seemed to distract me from that goal. On the other hand, loneliness left me with a lot of time to question everything about my life, every moment I shared with my wife, everything she ever said to me. I ended my journey nervous and feeling like I didn't have a core set of beliefs to hold on to. I was a shell of a man, wandering aimlessly through life. During my trip back, I stopped several times at national parks and monuments, mainly Devil's Tower, Mount Rushmore, and the Badlands, in an attempt to recapture the innocence of my youth. I even bought a ticket to the reptile gardens, remembering my trip. The exhibits and entertainment were about the same but not as exciting as I remembered. What I remembered as exciting now seemed banal and a little cheesy. I silently wondered if this was how all the memories in my life would end. I had no idea what to expect at home, but I knew what I wouldn't accept. Don't worry, I can already hear you, another doormat husband who was going to ignore his wife's infidelity. I can say that I didn't think so. I guess it's up to you to decide whether to believe it. My train of thought was quite simple. I didn't know enough. I didn't know what to do. Faced with a lack of information and the absence of a well-thought-out plan of action, I decided to do what I do best. Challenge my wife to talk, get the real story, and make a fact-based decision that would be best for me. Was I surprised by what was waiting for me at home? Not good. Did this deviate from my plan? Not one iota. What is the difference between my home and the morgue? The morgue houses the dead, but my house only housed the walking dead. My kids were sitting in the living room watching a movie. I accepted their embrace with as much enthusiasm as I could muster. Then the conversation started. How was my trip? Did I see anything interesting? Then came the reports of what happened in the house. But the strangest thing was my daughter's complete silence. She took her usual place next to me and continued her usual hugs, but she didn't say a word, which was unusual. I talked to the kids for a few minutes and then headed to the kitchen to get a glass of water. My daughter followed me. Something is wrong with Mom, Dad. She has barely left your room since you went to Grandma's. Okay, sweetie. Thank you for telling me. I'll go check on her in a minute. Our first meeting was not what I expected. Damn, who am I kidding? I had no idea what to expect. Stacy looked terrible, her hair was a mess, and it was clear that she had been crying. Our bedroom smelled like something had died. She was surprised when I entered the room and, for some time, maintained an awkward expression on her face. While we sat in a long silence, a few minutes later, Stacy walked over to the bedside table to pull out some papers and began handing them to me. My heart began to pound as I thought about what she could give me. I sighed when I saw that they were handwritten answers to my questions. I looked at them for a minute, then folded them in half and placed them next to me. I'm not sure I can adequately describe my feelings at that moment. These were feelings that lasted for years. Perhaps they are best described as contradictory. Did I love Stacy? Certainly. Did I want to punch her in the face? Yes. Was I ever going to do this? Never. Her first question could have been any of 1,000 important things that were running through my head. I truly believe that if her first question had been any different, things might have turned out differently. I'm not sure what you think of me. I don't mean to be dismissive, but I know I wouldn't have cared then, and I'm not sure I know now. I just know that there was an absolutely perfect set of circumstances that could have saved my marriage. Her question might have been the only thing that could have broken them. How did you know, Jacob? I didn't want to end my marriage. My whole world, friends, work, sense of self-worth, revolved around my marriage. But from everything I learned and heard, that one question hurt almost as much as anything else. Honestly, I don't think it's important, and frankly, I'm shocked that was the first thing that came out of your mouth. We sat in silence for a long time before she spoke again. At least the next questions were better. What are you thinking about, Jacob? What are you going to do? I have absolutely no idea. I just sat there for a long time together in the room alone with your thoughts. I then stood up and left the room, returning to spend the evening with the children. After the kids went to bed, I spent the first of many nights in the guest room. Was it irrational to be angry that I had made the decision to not sleep in my own bed? Maybe. Unfortunately, this was just the beginning. I spent the next few weeks next to a frightened Stacy. She carried out all her daily tasks with such care, as if her life depended on it. She was eerily quiet and literally jumped every time I spoke. Even this drove me crazy. Am I now some kind of wife-beating maniac? I read my wife's confession 10 days after she gave it to me. I will not list the entire list of her answers. There were only a few that were very important to me. Jessica is my daughter. No, she is not your biological daughter, but she's your daughter in every other way. Please never doubt this. If not, how long have you known that she is not mine? I always suspected that this was not the case, but I hoped that it was. I knew for sure after a 3-month checkup when I was told her blood type. I would have found out when she was 6 anyway. If you knew she wasn't mine, why didn't you tell me? I was afraid that you would leave me. I'm still afraid, in fact, terrified. Who else knows? My mother and Tricia. I don't know for sure, but based on several conversations, I'm convinced that your mom knew too. How many more times have you cheated on me? Once, just once. I swear on everything that is dear to me. I had answers to the questions I asked, but I still didn't know what I wanted. My choice was quite simple. I could have stayed married to Stacy and lived with the feeling that someone was stabbing a knife into my heart every day. I could have divorced her and started over, feeling like I had shot myself in the head. Which would you choose? You probably know. You are absolutely sure. I didn't know, and I wasn't. And so we lived for several months in awkward silence until the day Stacy found me alone. I don't remember the exact set of circumstances that led to us being left alone without children. I know I studiously tried to avoid being alone with Stacy, but it happened. Jacob, we need to talk about this. We can't go on like this forever. What makes you think that I even want to continue, let alone talk about it? Don't say that, Jacob. It was so long ago. A whole life has passed since that weekend. You don't want everything we've built together to go down the drain because of one stupid weekend. Whole life? This sounds right. There is something good in this, damn it, Jacob. You must talk to me. At this moment, I lost my temper. Honestly, I don't remember ever swearing at my wife or even raising my voice at her. Our arguments, even at our worst, were more passive-aggressive silent arguments. But I just couldn't take the pressure anymore. Great, do you want to talk? So speak. Talk to me about your stupid weekend. How would you describe it? I heard a fantastic summary from your buddy. Tell me all the juicy details. How was that for you? Did you like it? Did you enjoy humiliating me? Let's talk about it. Stacy pulled away for a moment but eventually continued. That's not what I wanted to talk about, Jacob. I wanted to talk about us. Oh, well, excuse me for thinking I was entitled to some answers. I guess you're used to being the only one in the know. Oh, wait, right, it wasn't just you. You shared your dirty little secret with your mom and best friend. Maybe we should start with this. Can you tell me, my loving wife, why I deserve so much less attention to the state of our marriage and the consequences of your actions than your mother? I tried to do what was best for you, Stacy. You did what was best for you, not for me, not for us, only you. So don't tell me what we should talk about, Jacob. I heard he said you were the biggest he had ever met. The biggest that ever walked the face of the earth, the best intim of his life. So, tell me all about it, darling. Stacy sat with unshed tears in her eyes, her mouth open, the color draining from her face. I did not care, so I looked her straight in the eye and whispered, next time you sit in front of me asking me to talk about us, be prepared to tell me the truth. And don't think that I will make your task easier for even a second. I will double-check every answer you give. Honestly, I don't know how she lasted so long. It's not that I was being intentionally cruel, but I definitely wasn't nice. I often left the room if she was in it. I never said more words to her than necessary. I slept in the guest room, and we haven't talked about anything significant since I returned. This went on for several months. I was considering the possibility of divorce. This was the path I was leaning towards, but at the time, it would have been devastating, both financially and professionally. Then there were my children. I couldn't bear the thought of being separated from my children. I didn't want to be a part-time dad. I just wasn't in the mood for it. So I had very little choice left, so I decided to try to make the best of an unbearable situation. Don't worry, I can still hear you. Another wimp husband? It wasn't like that at all. There was simply no clean break, so I did what I had to do. I took a long-term approach. It's hard to describe the madness that my life has become. I felt trapped in a world of lawyers and their talk about asset protection. The joy I felt being around my children and the rage I felt every time I thought about what Stacy had done to my life. But I also missed her. I missed our closeness and carefree lifestyle. I missed the time when everything in my life was in place and stability ruled the universe. What was it like? It was like I was a severe diabetic with a chocolate fetish. One wrong step, and you could literally die. But every day, someone puts in front of you for breakfast a piece of freshly baked chocolate cake with chocolate cream cheese frosting and a scoop of chocolate ice cream drizzled with chocolate sauce. You have to find the willpower not to eat it. You know there will be dire consequences if you do this. But you can't shake the fact that deep down you want to throw away your fork and spoon and dive face first into your plate. There were times when I returned to delirium. The fact that Stacy's mother and Tricia didn't even look me in the eye when we first met completely freaked me out. They lied to me for years, keeping the secret over my head. I felt like a fool when Tricia tried to mediate on Stacy's behalf. I told her to go to hell. She did not return to our house for several months. And then there were conversations. Horribly uncomfortable conversations about things I should have known but didn't want to hear. Conversations that almost always ended with Stacy in tears because as much as she believed that these conversations would help us reunite, she could hear the anger, disappointment, and pain in my words. You should know how much I love you. You know this, right? Certainly, and I know that you love me too. It just has to be true. I love you very much. Almost as much as I hate you. Then there was her big confession about how she dated Robert Paulson. He wasn't that good. She had had a little too much alcohol and was already irrationally angry with me. She made terrible decisions that she immediately regretted. It wasn't as bad as I thought. Did you do anything with him that you never did with me? The list of things I discovered with my wife shrank dramatically after she finished. The things I thought we shared exclusively and discovered over our years together were simply shattered. It was just a night, right? The most pointless part of any real marriage? Yes, she said. That too. So why did you repeat all your terrible decisions on the second night? She didn't have an answer. Did I really catch her in another lie? Who knows what expression was on her face? Hard to say. But after years of thinking I understood how to read my wife, I was as lost as a stranger meeting her for the first time on the street. Stacy's next attempt at reconciliation was what I expected, or at least should have expected. She knew I would be horny. 6 months passed, during which we took long showers and slept together. A day or two was the longest I've ever been away from the road. Almost every day, she tried to make small talk with me, but I usually refused her. She tried to touch me, take my hand, or touch my shoulder. I usually brushed her off. But one evening, when the children were out with friends, she took it too far. As I said, I was very careful to make sure that at least one of the children was with us in the house. I had no reason to want to be alone with Stacy, but I got the dates and times mixed up. And my daughter was at a school party, and the boys were at a baseball game with friends. When she walked into the living room without clothes as the day she was born, something primal took over. That night, I had in with my wife with hatred. The tender caresses and the feeling of closeness were gone. They were replaced by hair-grabbing, slaps, and pinches of flesh designed to evoke fear. In her eyes? I didn't pay attention to our mutual satisfaction. I cared only about my pleasure and those sounds of pleasure and pain that escaped from her mouth. Normally, I would have been worried that I had gone too far, but that's not true. I know I didn't care. I finally left her on the floor to shower and go to bed. The lack of noise when the children returned from their walk was the only sign that it had moved. The next day, I was surprised to see a look in her eyes that indicated she thought we were in a better place. I put an end to these thoughts a few hours later. I think he was right. You are a. She didn't answer. Thus began our years of uncomfortable proximity. After some time, our lives returned to a normal, albeit somewhat painful routine. After a few more months, the children stopped asking if everything was okay, happy to receive a huge amount of attention from both Stacy and me. I found peace again in being in the same room as Stacy when we weren't alone. Sometimes we chatted about meaningless things, sometimes we talked about us and our marriage. I tried my best to forgive and forget. I'm not just pretending. After almost 4 years of hell, my preparations for divorce were complete. My business, my assets, a large nest egg, everything was protected and awaiting my decision. It helped me get rid of the feeling that I had a gun pointed at my head and was forced to make a decision that was not in my best interest. Then I started doing almost daily research. Marriage problems, forgiveness. If there was a book, article, or something written on this topic on the internet, I read it. Artistic and non-fiction literature. If there was a film about betrayal, I watched it. In fact, Stacy and I watched it together. It was a story about a supposedly happily married woman who accidentally meets a young lover on the street and their short whirlwind romance. In the end, her husband killed her lover, and they seemed to have reconciled, although the ending was somewhat murky. Stacy quietly sobbed throughout the entire film. It didn't bother me at all. Then I realized that I was so desensitized to these feelings that I didn't even get angry when my wife cheated on her husband. I didn't feel anything. So I started seeing a therapist a few months after this. Stacy and I began marriage counseling. Like I said, I really tried. Our story was simple. My wife cheated on me once for 2 days. Stacy only loved me and no one else, and she made a terrible mistake. I verified her truthfulness on all these issues and believed her. My daughter's biological father was my wife's lover. I love my girl with all my heart, and that hasn't changed one bit. But I couldn't get over the years of lies. I tried, but I couldn't. I was stuck in purgatory, wanting to move on and maybe move on, but unable to do so without the thing I treasured most in my existence. Months and months of repeated discussions didn't do much for our awkward relationship. To be honest, I felt that my sessions with both therapists were basically a waste of money. But conversations, experiences, and explorations of my thoughts and memories led me to a revelation. It came to me during a session together when I was encouraged to find the strength within myself to truly forgive my wife. But my attention was focused on the photograph hanging on the wall. It was an engraving of the Rocky Mountains. And then it dawned on me. A $100 picture could have saved me thousands of medical bills and years of self-doubt. I felt like an idiot when I realized what was holding me back. I agree with both of you. I have to forgive my wife, myself, and of course, I didn't. But it suddenly occurred to me why I still couldn't do this. It's so simple that I even feel stupid saying it out loud. But I guess it's never too late. Stacy, I will never forgive you because in all our long conversations about saving our marriage, you never, not once, asked for forgiveness. Those who sincerely repent make amends and receive forgiveness. And again, my mother helped me. She spoke these words shortly after she had recovered from the shock of my statement and realized that it was true. But I think at that moment, she knew, even if subconsciously. I'm sorry, Jacob. More than I've ever been and more than I'll ever be. I'm really sorry. After that night, Stacy and I lived together for another 6 years. We were roommates and sometimes at night, but the love that filled our souls truly died that night in my hotel room so long ago and so far from home. Eventually, I was able to tell Stacy about that evening without feeling sick to my stomach. During this conversation, we were perhaps the closest we came to understanding each other. Her betrayal and my discovery killed our love, and no matter how hard we tried, we would not be able to rekindle the passion of our youth. We would not be able to grow together as partners into old age. We never talked about it out loud, but she knew. My final epiphany came when the twins were juniors in high school. They were doing some kind of science project, and I watched, never ceasing to be amazed at their ability to communicate without words. One of the boys filled a large beaker with some clear solution, another placed 1 drop of another blood-red chemical there. I sat and watched as this tiny, insignificant drop of liquid contaminated the entire solution. It worked its way through the clear liquid, and eventually, the entire beaker turned pale pink. No part was left untouched. I thought this was an appropriate metaphor for my life. One lie, 1 2-day period, infected my entire life. Nothing was left untouched. Memories of my marriage, relationships with my children, my intimate life, one lie infected them all. And although my anger subsided over time, a subtle trace of mistrust remained on everything in my life. I just couldn't get rid of it, no matter how hard I tried. When I finally decided it wasn't worth trying, I just lived with it. When that didn't work, I gave up. I don't know why Stacy stayed. I stayed for the children and the memories I will cherish by being the best father I could be. Stacy was a super mom, simply the best. But when the twins entered middle school, she began working full-time. She didn't make new friends or try to leave me. She went to work and returned home. This was her life. Whatever was keeping her static, she wasn't taking it very well. Every year, she gained several pounds. She had lost much of her generally pleasant personality. After a while, she just looked old and tired. After the first year or so, I stopped saying mean and hurtful things to Stacy. But looking back, that was the cruel thing I ever did. It seemed that the true opposite of love was apathy. I continued to make moves to further separate our finances. I found hobbies and other activities to occupy my time. I began to invest more and more of my time in friendships with golf buddies, people from church, and anyone else who shared my interests. Finally, we really grew apart, and I didn't put much effort into keeping us together. I was thinking about making our almost loveless relationship permanent. Simple affection was almost enough. But one night in the hotel bar changed everything. A night of unbridled passion among single people made me realize it was time to let her go or grow into the person I never wanted to be. When the twins left for college, our divorce became the most anti-menopausal event of all time. I placed the papers in front of her at dinner on the 3rd evening of our life together. She smiled sadly and said 2 words before signing the papers, "Okay, Jacob." The division of the estate was generous in her favor but left my business completely intact and provided me with a very comfortable retirement life with minimal effort. Stacy will be very comfortable too, and that was all. That's how I ended up in this place to this day. After all, Stacy wasn't the one who ruined our marriage, it was me. If I had laid out a set of requirements that Stacy had to meet absolutely without question in order to save our marriage, she would have passed them with flying colors. There was no more repentant, submissive, devoted woman on the planet. Stacy never refused me anything ever. To be honest, it made me angry too. My partner, my equal, had disappeared. This woman was replaced by a little frightened girl. I often wondered how Stacy lived with her secret for so long. Having that knowledge over someone definitely tips the balance, and when it was tipped in my favor, I couldn't help but feel differently about it. The saddest thing about this whole story is that I truly believe that Stacy still loves me to this day. She doesn't go on dates, and I can always find her at home alone if we need to discuss anything related to the children or grandchildren. But I just couldn't stomach the years and years of lies, and I couldn't find the strength to truly forgive her, even if it was better for me. If you're able to follow this logic, then you are a better person than me. This twisted logic is what remains of my personal life. I know full well that I can never get back what I had with Stacy. I'm too old to even think about starting over, and everyone I meet seems to have some kind of baggage that precludes any possibility of serious commitment. But I do feel like I did the right thing by my kids, and Stacy too, for that matter. So I sleep peacefully at night, mostly alone, but sometimes without it. I have no problem if you question my judgment. I know I doubted it, and I still doubt it. Was there one event that happened so long ago that should have been unforgivable, or was my life one continuous life superimposed on another? Did I raise someone else's daughter as if she were my own? Yes, but I never loved her less after I found out. I never told her the truth, and I don't think Stacy did either. If she guessed it herself, she didn't say anything and didn't change her behavior towards me. I don't know the right answer. Does it exist? Who the hell knows? I am no longer a truly happy person, but I'm not unhappy either. I live one day after another. Sometimes I yearn for my old life, but not too often, honestly. Mostly, I'm fine. Real life has an end, and they are not always happy. And that was my story. What do you think of our story today? It seems to me that the wife should not have ruined such a great relationship with such a great husband. They had just started to develop and were perfect for each other. What's your opinion? Write your opinion in the comments. See you in the next video.